one of the co-authors of the paper that I'm trying to present today, Professor Cristobal K. Thank you very much for inviting us here. We have 20 minutes, and I think I have 18 slides, so I have to be quite fast again. Okay, our tasks, just to clarify, we have two tasks. One is the main task, and the other is a secondary task. The first task is to try to make sense and try to have a reflection of the 17 case studies of so-called land grabbing in the region and set it against the ongoing discourse on this theme more globally, more internationally, and try to see where the current insights from this region stand. The other one is, and which is a more peripheral and secondary task, is to also take some glances at the 17 studies here against the key findings of the UN CFS High-Level Panel of Experts land grab report released in July of 2011, of which I was also involved. So in short, it's more of an outsider's perspective on the 17 studies you have here, which, by the way, is, if you haven't all read all the 17 studies, you have, because I think they're hefty and really offer fresh and original empirical insights of what's going on in this region. Our timetable to do our task was really kind of very limited. I think 2 months that I say here is too generous. I think we had less than that. So it was kind of under severe constraint that we did this study. So yeah, okay. I begin by saying that the FAO framework that guided all the 17 studies were both wide and narrow. Was both wide and narrow. It was wide because it was framed within the broader land market dynamics. It therefore allows for the authors to gather data and try to analyze them from the more broader kind of perspective of agrarian change dynamics. But it is also quite narrow because it is very well defined and a very strict definition of what land grab is. And that is underpinned by 3 interlinked features. One is that it should be significant, there should be a significant extent of recent large-scale land acquisitions. 2, there should be involvement of foreign governments in these land deals. 3rd, there should be some negative impact in varying extents of these land investments on food security of the countries involved. 3, very important specific features that define land grab in the studies. With that, the conclusion is that land grabs occur in this region only in 2 countries, Brazil and Argentina, and doesn't occur elsewhere. So you will see in all the 17 studies there is some kind of tension because the data gathered tried to speak of something broader, something deeper, but then at the same time constrained with a very strict definitions of land grabs. So I think that's an important clarification. The problem is that if we define land grab too narrowly, we risk missing too much. So if we define it just the way, for example, this particular research defined it, then we would miss a lot of things that are happening in the actual agrarian world. The problem of defining it too broadly, on the other hand, risks losing a lot of the crucial, distinctive features of what is going on today. So the challenge is how do we consider it given these 2 potential risks? For us, instead of searching for a very strict definition, we thought that, which is more descriptive, we thought that pulling out key defining features, not definition, but defining features would allow us to be more analytical and would guide us more and try to make sense of what's happening here on the land front. So that's what we did. And we have 6 defining features that I would go very rapidly, 7, I mean. that guided our analysis of the 17 studies. First, there should be relatively large-scale acquisitions made through long-term land lease, purchase, and or a variety of other institutional arrangements ranging from contract loan schemes to supermarket contracts and to reforestation and other large-scale conservation. I think that speaks to what we have in 17 studies. Second point, the objective and or result of which is large-scale extraction, and the key word here is extraction of land, water, and other closely linked natural resources through the production of food and non-food goods. Third, and involving either the capture of or shift in control, and the key words are capture of or shift in control over the meaning, use, and purpose of land, water, and other closely linked natural resources. Fourth, involving a variety of investors, natural persons, and corporate, private, public, and public-private investment groups, domestic and foreign. Fifth, involving lands in a wide variety of agroecological conditions, productive lands, and forested uplands. Sixth, and across diverse property rights regimes, be it private lands, community, or state public lands. The first 6 key features, if we take a look at that, then we will see a lot of land grabs, but still wouldn't be able to identify the distinct feature of what is happening in the current moment of history. And so we go to the 7th feature, which brings us to this specific moment of history, which is the basic transaction is linked to the recent changing character and dynamics of the global food energy regime, which is marked by convergence of 3 crises, at least 3 crises. One is the global food fuel complex, the changing dynamics there, going more for a polycentric regime with multiple centers of power, with the rise of BRICS and many of the middle-income countries mixed with multi-directional flows. It's no longer just the traditional food regime based on both sides of North Atlantic. 2, it should be linked to environmental protection concerns. We heard about the phenomenon of green grabbing and all these things. It should be also related to that. And finally, to financial crisis, financial investment shifting out of stock markets into safer investment like land. So those are our key analytical guide to look at the 17 case studies. Using that, to complement the narrower definition of the FA used for this research, we concluded 11 points, key points, that we thought are important insights that could link up what's happening in this region to the broader phenomenon happening elsewhere in other regions. I'll go very quickly on the 11 highlights of our findings. One is that the extent of land grabbing in the region in terms of number of countries involved and area covered is wider than previously assumed. More generally, its possible implication globally is that it will also indirectly kind of imply that the assumption that much of the land grabs in the world today occurs, at least 70% of which occurs in Africa, might relatively change with the current kind of reflection of the extent of this phenomenon in this region. But again, it's still quite a challenge to actually quantify it. And we really kind of stay away, shy away from the business of quantifying how many hectares of land were grabbed in the world at a given moment, because that gives us the problem of coming up with defining how can we quantify something that we have difficulty defining. Second, land grabbing occurs across land property rights regimes. In the global context today, in the global discourse, we always hear in the dominant discourse saying that, well, land grabs occur and people are dispossessed and expelled from their land because they do not have secure land access. They do not have private property to these land resources. But it's assuming that much of the land grabs occur in public, state-controlled land resources. But what the 17 case studies show here, land deals occur across property rights regimes, private, public, state lands, community lands, indigenous communities, and also in a variety of mechanisms from outright purchase to land leasing and contract growing schemes. Although I think the scale of private lands involved here compared to other countries, regions elsewhere, is relatively higher. Third, there are 4 types of land investors in this region. International, the phenomenon. Second, the phenomenon Transnational investors. Third, domestic, national investors. And fourth is the fuzzy category of very difficult to identify and determine kind of ways. The last point is more of the blurring of categories by nationality, because these are companies where it's very difficult to pin down where their origins are, and this is part of the financialization of this land investments phenomenon. So you will see in the 17 reports, we will see a lot of companies based in Cayman Islands and Panama, which are known tax havens. By international comparison, the region is different from the process in Africa, where at least the reported dominant players are transnational, transregional investors. Here, it's more, they are relatively marginal compared to the intra-regional, national, transnational investors. And that's a major kind of difference in terms of feature, which would link the Latin American phenomenon closer to the Southeast Asian experience, where a lot of intra-regional investors are actually playing more important roles. But similar to all other regions, the key role of domestic national capital is also very, very important in this region as elsewhere in other regions of the world. Fourth, land grabbing occurs not only to produce food. The dominant narrative, of course, tells us that there was a land grab because of the 2007-2008 food price hike, and so people, different countries felt food insecure, and so the rush for land to capture lands to produce food for export. But what we see here, of course, is that food, of course, especially livestock, are very much part of the scene here of land investments. But there is also a distinctly Latin American kind of phenomenon of the rise of what we call the flex crops. Crops that have multiple and flexible uses that are easily kind of changed in terms of crop use over time. So palm oil, sugarcane, soya, in the context of the changing dynamics of the food feed fuel complex. And that's a very important phenomenon that is not found in the same extent and scale in other regions of the world, experiencing surge in land investment. And of course, the extent of non-food sectors here is also kind of phenomenal. The case of this region tells us more deeply and gives us a better kind of analytical handle in terms of going away from the dominant narrative that is food crisis-centric analysis explaining the global land rush. Because it's not just about the food crisis and food. It's far more deeper and far more broader than that. Fifth, it seems that in most cases land use have not resulted in immediate large-scale negative impact on food security. And part of the reason is that staple food remains in the hands of small farming communities. I am talking here of the broader picture. I'm sure there are pockets of cases where food security of communities and households were undermined. If you have massive kind of expulsion of peasants or indigenous communities from their lands, for example, in some areas of Afro-Colombia, then for sure there will be some negative impact on the food security of the household and communities. But more broadly, as compared to other regions, you don't see the scale and problems we see, for example, in Africa, in terms of having a very negative impact on the food security of countries that are already food insecure in the first place, that are embarking into food production for export, which doesn't make much sense. We don't see much of that kind of problematic situation here, at least not based on the 17 country studies we saw. Sixth, the dominant narrative on land grabs is that they say that most of the land grabs occur and the negative impacts occur because they are normally carried out in countries of transition from that are of fragile character, fragile states and weak states, though post-conflict situations. Well, we always say Brazil and Argentina, for one, are very different from Rwanda or DRC in terms of political conditions. You don't see that kind of settings here in Latin America happening. It's a very different kind of situation where also this massive corruption and under-the-table shady deals. We don't see that kind of extreme cases, for example, in Africa or in post-Soviet Eurasia happening here in Latin America, or not at least in the way we read the 17 studies proves. 7. There's also, of course, no consensus between state and civil society organizations and farmers organizations about what's happening or about land investments. But the state played a key role in all these land investments, most especially in trying around the issue of marginal, available, and empty lands narrative. And we enumerated there how exactly they perform this task. But it's also the fact that we observe, based on the reports, 17 studies, that while there are pockets of oppositions from farmers groups, indigenous communities, and civil society organizations against it, by and large, it is generally thin, weak, uneven, and inconsistent opposition. And there might be, and this is similar to many different regions, and there are different explanations for this, including the fact that many of the sites of land grabs on the one side are different on the other side on the mass base of organized social movements. 8. Land use change. We always kind of protest, like the caricature is that we protest lands devoted to food or forests being converted to food for export or to biofuels for export. And we say that's almost kind of, that angers people for good reason. But what we see here in Latin America, based on the 70 studies, it's a far more diverse and multi-directional flows of land use change. And it's not just that caricature. 9. The dominant, sometimes casual narrative is that land grabs result to land dispossession. Well, those are two different phenomena and processes. And in this region, reading on the 17 studies, it's not very much a significant process where land deals resulted in the expulsion of peasants from their lands. There are, again, important pockets in different countries, but as a regional phenomenon, compared, for example, to what is happening in Africa or in places like Cambodia, you don't see that scale. I'm almost finishing now. The 10th is that, well, I'll come back to this slide with the concluding slide. 11. This phenomenon is both old and new. Of course, land grabs and expansion to the frontier is never new in this region. The history of this region is the history of bringing in new land from the land frontier into agricultural production, always. But there are new features of this renewed rush for land in this region, similar to other regions elsewhere in the world. One implication of this rush in land investments is to bring older public action frameworks like land reform. Never in the moment of history that land reform and the distributive reforms become just as important. But we wonder, because many of the land deals also in this region and other regions of the world they occur in settlements and communities who were beneficiaries of earlier land reforms. So to say that the problem is land grabs, the solution is land reform, doesn't really square the problem. It doesn't make much sense, because many of the land grabbing deals occur in land reform communities. So I think it challenges us to think deeper and more broadly and more creatively on what can we do to maneuver in public action in this very complex and newer kind of relationship. Our final reflection point on final slide is this. If we are thinking about, well, what is to be done? Whether we are in the ministry, or we are a peasant or a farm worker movement, or we are NGO research or academic researchers, what is to be done? How do we make much sense of these things? Because we also don't want to say no to land and agricultural investments. We all know that that is also a very necessary kind of process. But we ask, under what terms, under what conditions do we want these land investments to occur? And we have this typology. Of course, typology is just a representation of ideal types. They don't normally represent the actually existing real world, but it helps us explore analytically. Type A and type H, those are the two extremes. Type A, there are 3 columns. Questions about changes in land property relations. The second column is about food security. The third column is about the impact on ecologies, the biophysical atmosphere of the world. And we say type A is the dream world, is the world we all want. We want land investments, but we want it there. It should be redistributed and democratic access to land resources. But we also want it to be producing food for all, and not just food for the few, to paraphrase the Mexican scholar Hela Otero. And then it should also have a sustaining and more kind of ecologically nurturing impact. The opposite pole is what we all kind of are scared and protest, which is it's reconcentrating access and control over land resources on one side. It's not even producing food for all. And it has a massive negative impact on the biophysical environment. Well, in real life, of course, we know that types A and B are hardly the most ideal actually existing scenario. Actually, we see that in real life, we see a lot of combinations from B, C, D, E, F, and G. And those combinations actually make our work and life very difficult, because those are matters of choices, because these are dilemmas. One scenario may be good on agrarian justice issues, but may be bad on environmental justice issues, and vice versa. So it's like, what are the public action choices that we have? We would like to leave it there. Thank you very much.